Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine from the Ridgefield Historical Society, and welcome to week 3 of The Long and Winding Road with Dr. Darla Shaw. I'd just like to take a minute to thank our Votes for Women partners, and in particular, the Connecticut Humanities who helped to support this program. So now I'd like to introduce Darla.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. This is such a special program for me because we have 2 people from Ridgefield who actually knew Alice Paul. We have Deborah Beals Ali and we have Josette Williams. They both have fascinating stories about knowing this woman in the latter part of her life. But before I start tonight, we have to pay a tribute to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We did not get into the third set of shoulders on which we stand as women. But if we're going with the third set of shoulders, or even the second, if we combine the first and second, this woman was a leader, along with the others that we had, which were Betty Friedan, Shirley Chisholm. We also had Gloria Steinem, and we had Bella Abzug. These women changed and further developed what Alice and Susan and Elizabeth and all these other women did. Think about what we talked about. Women getting into Ivy League colleges. Ruth was able to do this. She's head of Harvard Law Review. She's first in her class. She can't get a job as a lawyer. We talked about this. She had to teach law instead. This woman did so much to change health rights for women, pay for women, and at the end of every speech that we talked about for the last 3 weeks, these great women said one thing: the fight will never, ever end. And look what's happening today. You can see the fight already starting. So I don't want to talk anymore. I want to introduce you to Deborah and her wonderful story about Alice.
Hi, good evening to everybody. I'm going to turn the wheels back to March of 1974 when I had turned 16 years old. I could not wait to start work, and I wanted to be in the healthcare field. So I went to Altna-Craig, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with if you grew up here in Ridgefield or have been living in Ridgefield for a while. It was the beautiful white mansion up on High Ridge Road. At the time, it was an 18-bed nursing home. And so I went there to apply for a nurse's aide job and wound up getting it starting on my 16th birthday, and was a nurse's aide for the general population there. And I remember one day the ambulance pulled up and in came a woman, a petite woman, being wheeled in on a stretcher. And I welcomed her and went into the room with her. And she was very feisty and didn't want anyone to touch her, didn't want anyone to help her. And the staff there had a little bit of difficulty with her because she was not really amenable to doing anything that they had asked her to do. She didn't want to eat. She didn't want to get changed. She didn't want anyone to touch her. And for some reason, I took that as a challenge, and I started to befriend her. And over the course of some time, she and I developed this relationship to the point where her nephew, Donald Paul, asked me if I would be her private duty aide. Now, all I knew was that her name was Alice Paul. At that time, we didn't study Alice Paul in school. Of course, now the students learn about Alice Paul, but at that time we didn't do that. And so I became a private duty aide for this woman that I really didn't know a heck of a lot about, other than to think she was a really feisty woman, and had some interesting stories that I, at the time, didn't know if they were accurate or not. But it wasn't until much later that I listened to the movie Iron-Jawed Angels. And at the time, I thought, oh my gosh, I can now understand why some of the reactions that she had coming into this nursing home were as genuine as they were. After seeing the movie, I saw that she was thrown into the paddy wagon, she was strapped down, and I realized that somebody who had just sustained a stroke, coming into a nursing home, being tied down on a stretcher for her own safety, this was really analogous to what was happening many, many years ago as she was being brought into prison. She didn't want to be fed because she was being force fed back in the days when she was being thrown into prison. The IVs were similar to being force fed. The strapping down was what was happening in the back of the paddy wagons. And it really shed some light to me about who this woman was. Again, as I said, I didn't realize really at the time what had happened. The more that I understood who she was and the significance of this woman who I was working with, I remember saying to her, "Oh my goodness, Miss Paul, you know, I'm calling you Miss Paul, and you're such a wise woman with all these degrees. Should I be calling you Dr. Paul or something different?" And she looked at me and she said to me, "No," she said, "you will call me Miss Paul, and I will call you Betty, dear." And I thought, that's wonderful, but my name is Debbie. And for the years that I worked with her, she continued to call me Betty, dear. And so my big claim to fame, anytime I would get her ready for an interview or something, or the newspaper would come in and take pictures, somebody would say to her, "Oh, you look so lovely." And she'd say, "Betty, dear, got me ready." And so I never had any accolades, knowing that it was Debbie that got her ready. Another story that I love to tell, when I was working there, my sister, Sandy Carpenter, would often come in and chat with her as well. And they both shared the same birthday, January 11th. My sister is much the same build that I am. And of course, Miss Paul was petite and a little bit hunched over with a forward head. And when my sister would come in, she was so tall and on the larger side. And Miss Paul would call her my little twin. And so here my sister was, and here Miss Paul was, and she would refer to them as my little twin. So I love some of the name stories. She never wanted any attention on herself. It was always what she referred to as the cause. And I'm sure when Josette starts to speak a little bit about her interaction with her, she'll indicate the same. I remember as she approached 90, people wanted to celebrate her 90th birthday, but she really didn't want the focus on her birthday. She wanted to gather as many people as she could to work towards the Equal Rights Amendment, towards the cause. And she would put her hand in the air and she would talk, again, a little bit hunched over. "We're going to work towards the cause," she would say. And she would rally as many people as she could to do that. And here at the point, I guess I was probably 17 now, maybe going on 18, she was going to gather me and my friends to see if we could help her with that. She would tell some stories. One of my favorite stories that she used to tell was going back, and we would sit, as you can imagine, a private duty aide spent a lot of time not only getting her ready for the day and all the hygiene and whatever other things we had to do, but we had plenty of time to read together and talk and tell stories. But one of my favorite stories she would tell me was the amount of time that they would picket on the White House lawn. And one particular event, she was going out on the White House lawn and Woodrow Wilson would come out. Again, it was a very different time back then when the presidents were more free to come and go. And Woodrow Wilson would come out onto the front lawn and would say to them, you know, "No more picketing on the lawn." He had it. And he said to them, "If you come back and carry your signs on the White House lawn one more time, I'm going to have you thrown in prison." And I guess he had this discussion with the women. And so she said, "Well, he's warned us that if we picket and carry our signs one more time, these signs that we've made on the White House lawn, that we're going to be thrown in prison again." And so she gathered her women and she said, "Well, we're going to fix him." She said, "We are not going to go back tomorrow with our signs." And so that evening she gathered all the women together and they wrote "Equal Rights for Women" on their petticoats. Oh, if I don't get that, excuse me. Oh.
I think I'm going to enjoy following Debbie because I couldn't agree more.
I'm sorry about that.
This was the most honest and really not important of herself, but of everybody else and the cause.
She did. She always talked about the cause. she would say across their petticoats was equal rights for women, and that way Woodrow Wilson could not do anything to them because they were not carrying their signs. They had them on their petticoats, and so he had to honor what he had told the women, that they were not carrying their signs. So she was certainly a phenomenal, phenomenal, phenomenal woman, and the stories just were endless. So I hope you all enjoyed that a little bit. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I think Catherine was going to entertain if anyone had some questions on that.
Yes, if you have a question for Deborah, please type it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll be happy to read off any questions that you might have. So nothing has, oh, here we have a first question from Cara. Any more stories? They are wonderful. So,
you know, she was just very clever. I'm trying to think of some in particular, but her stories were always how she could circumvent a situation. And she was so, I want to say conniving, but in a very positive way. If there was a roadblock, she was somebody who was going to figure out how to get past that roadblock, not let it defeat her. And her stature was so small, you wouldn't think of that as someone who would do that, but yet she was so creative and clever and really a wise woman. I can't think in particular of some of the stories now. If I do, I'll come in and chime in at the end again. But she was so funny, and I do remember laughing with her. And she had a wonderful sense of humor. I do remember that as well. And she just could laugh at herself too. And I remember, you know, one of the stories, I just remember her hand always up in the air, the cause. I wonder if Josette will talk about that as well, but everything was the cause and her hand was up in the air. And then I can't think of any other particular stories. If I do, I'll come up with them at the end.
So Deborah, we have one more question from Cara. She says, did she talk about the famous parade that she planned prior to Woodrow Wilson's inauguration?
I don't remember hearing about that. No, I don't remember hearing about that.
Okay. And then Martha has a question. Did Alice Paul share any of her experiences in England with you? And if so, was her recollection positive or negative?
No, do you know, most of the stories that I do have any grasp of were all here in the US. I don't remember a lot of the things that were from the England encounters at all.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Does anyone have just a last question? We're going to go to Josette next, and then we'll ask some questions again. There'll be other opportunities during the program to ask questions. So Deborah, thank you so much. And if we want to just move the screen over and
share with Josette right here and turn this way and let Josette take over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Debbie, thank you. I envy you the afternoons you spend with her. I just going to talk a little bit about her motivation. It really was motivating in awareness of how women had been treated and in citizenship, and then changed to constitutional concerns. She really was born in 1885, as you said, in a Quaker family. And I try to remember some of the context of what made her the mighty force that she was as an individual in the middle of any context, whether it was the United States Senate or the United Nations. She was an amazing, amazing person, but her family was Quaker, and always in the Quaker faith, men and women are equal. And that was the context that she came from. She was very careful about educating herself too. And I was particularly impressed about the later education, which enabled her to deal with people in the United Nations. She had a BA from Swarthmore College, an MA in sociology, and a PhD in economics from UPenn. She was really kind of interested in social work. So she went to England in order to find out, I guess, how things were happening there, because England was dealing with the First World War, and there was a tremendous amount of misuse of women in every way. And I think you could fair to say that she got fairly radicalized and fairly much aware of what was happening with women, especially in England. They were treated terribly, and she saw it throughout some of Europe. And when she came back to the United States 5 years later, she was definitely radicalized. When she was in England, for instance, any woman that had married a German was stripped of all the land that her family might own. She had to assume the citizenship of whatever country the man was from. And this was really culturally true throughout the world. Women simply assumed the citizenship of men that they married. And if it happened to be a German after the First World War, they were ostracized. They were considered enemy aliens. So she arrives in this context to show that she was in full sympathy with the women there. They were demonstrating violently, and that's where she picked up her habits. She came back in I guess it was about 5 years, and she hit the United States at the time when the women were just beginning to really have an effect in their efforts toward getting the franchise. She was very, very dramatic. I think she even chained herself to the White House fence. This was why she was arrested, and her crime was demonstrating in front of the White House. I wonder what they would do now with them. When she did get totally radicalized, and I don't think that many of the women who were on a path to gain the right to vote, they really didn't like her. They didn't like her methods. They didn't, I guess, understand the strength of the English radicalization of it. They lost their citizenship, but that was normal if they married somebody else. That was normal throughout the world. So Alice Paul arrived back, and she formed the National Women's Party. Other women agreed with her, and so there were two sort of main forces of women. One was being polite and using the right teacup and telling people that they really thought they ought to have the vote, and the other was being force-fed and jailed and yelling. So she did form the National Women's Party, and they got finally through to people. And in 1920, which is what we're celebrating right now, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment of the Constitution, in which women were granted the right to vote. Now, most suffragettes were a lot older of Alice Paul. She was 35 in that year. So they retired to a well-earned rest. But she, Alice Paul, went forward violently, and she had her National Women's Party, and she had started to realize that tying herself to the gates of the White House was not really the best way of reaching the most influential people. So she went to war herself. First, she went to school. She got an LLB in the Washington School of Law. She got a master's in law at the American University, and she got a doctorate of civil law at the American University. And then she formed the World Party of Equal Rights for Women. That was gender equality that they were asking for, not just vote, but gender equality. So her focus began to change from just worrying about voting to worrying about the power constitutionally. It was all the way back then that she began on that. She did form the World Party of Equal Rights for Women, and they actually succeeded in getting gender equality in the preamble of the United Nations Charter. It's the second sentence in the preamble, quite a victory. So then she moved toward Congress. She was trying very much to get equal rights, not only on voting, but on citizenship altogether. In 1934, she actually motivated Congress. She was almost the singular person motivating, asking for help from members of Congress from New York there. So in 1934, they succeeded in getting Congress to pass the Equal Citizenship Bill signed by FDR in 1934 in May. People refer to it as the Alice Paul Bill because she was so singular in her influence. She established by that bill a woman's right to pass her citizenship on to her children. This was a tremendous step forward. And again, she was probably one of the few that realized women's voting was just the beginning. It was the citizenship, and actually the citizenship of everyone, that needed to be planted firmly in the Constitution. But she did get at least Congress to pass this bill. It was right then, I was born 3 months after that bill was passed in August of 1934. My dad was Canadian, my mother was an American citizen, and I am considered a natural born citizen because of that law. It was because women, by that law, could pass their citizenship on to their children, no matter where they were born. It was, I had been born in Japan. My mother was American, dad was Canadian, and it was only because of this bill allowing women to pass their citizenship on to their children, both male and female, wherever they were born. Most of you probably are citizens because you were born in the United States. That automatically makes you a citizen. But what happened to those whose marriage to a foreigner resulted in having babies overseas? They were not allowed prior to 1934. They were not allowed to pass their citizenship on. And that was what that corrected. It was for people who had been born after the law was passed. My oldest sister was also born in Japan, but she was born in 1929, before Alice Paul's law was passed. And well, there'll be more on that later. A natural born in the Constitution does not mean born on US territory, as so many seem to think. It means those born with a natural right to citizenship from the day of birth. And of course, if you're born in the United States, that applies. You are automatically a citizen then. Well, in 1977, I discovered that Alice Paul was living 2 blocks away from me in Ridgefield on High Ridge Road. And I went over to thank her. I happened to be a reporter for the press, but just went to thank her. That didn't really impress her. I walked in, and our mutual friend had introduced me to her, and I was fascinated. This very, very meek looking for a moment, and then I really looked at her sitting in the chair. She looked very determined. She reminded me of a person who had grown to be very, very angry. I think you found that as well. And I did thank her. And then I just asked her, why were you so involved? Why did it matter to you that somebody born overseas that could not take the citizenship of their mother, only from their father? And she started talking then. And she went for maybe 20 minutes describing everything. I put it in her obituary that I wrote. I was working for the Bridgeport Post. So I wrote about her. Her comments about all of the citizenship were of a woman who had gone from a very passive family and background through anger, watching what happened in England, watching what happened to herself. And she described the work that was involved in getting that bill past Congress. She said it wasn't easy. And she could remember, she was 92 at the time, the names of every person that had helped, every teenage girl who had testified in front of a Congress, the battles of committees, the votes that were taken. And it just really was a fighting battle all the way up to the passage of the legislation. And the whole description of that 20 minutes, it seemed to me it was equal to a well-prepared college-level course in practical politics. She remembered every detail. And she asked then if I would help her when she found out that I was a newspaper reporter, but I wasn't there on an interview like that. But she asked me if I would come back and help her to put together and study the current laws. And she was talking with Herb Camp, who was a lawyer in Ridgefield, and they were together trying to bone up on her knowledge of current law so that they could get this whole business of women's citizenship into the Constitution. Her focus then was changing. It was going from simple voting to really a basic national and international citizenship. And that should be in the Constitution of the United States. So it was a fascinating talking to her, listening to her. And she asked if I would help her, if I would come back and work with her and get the women's rights written, not just in congressional legislation, because in Congress, you can change it. It's vulnerable to congressional change. So she was hard at work in 1977, months before her death at age 92 years of age, when she was really hard at work, working for citizens' rights in the Constitution. As her focus changed, and the ERA was written, she did that at the age of 38. She drafted the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was one simple sentence: equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That was all. So her whole focus then began to change. And in 1972, the Senate approved the ERA, and the constitutional amendment was sent out for states' ratification. And it needed the ratification of 38 states. As it turned out, the ratification deadline, when they pass something and then you have to go maybe 5 years or whatever deadline they put on it to ratify it by the different states. And that's the deadline. And they didn't meet it, actually. They were missing 3 states to ratify this constitutional amendment. And the deadline eventually was extended, and they still didn't meet it. And quite surprisingly, in 2020, this year, the deadline was removed. And in 2019, Virginia ratified the ERA, completing the total ratification votes required. So now the argument is the legitimacy of this constitutional amendment is going to come up again. You better be ready for it, because the legitimacy of the late ratifications are now questioned. So you're soon going to be hearing about this again. Her very hard efforts on all counts were not secure in her way, in her opinion. So she's still working away at it, still hoping that it will be ratified, and it probably will be. But you're going to be hearing about it again. And so she has not only formed national and international people for women's rights, but she now is going to get this passed again, probably, for the whole nation. Now, if you were to take something away from this, I would hope you would find how effective a single person can be. She even canceled her engagement to be married so that she could concentrate on, she never did get married. And I hope you would appreciate her preparation of how to fight, going to all those colleges, getting all of those degrees so that she would have the legal background to fight for this. And then I hope you might realize that Congress can play with their legislation, and you don't want that to happen. I'll give you an example. My sister was born in 1929 in Japan of a Canadian father and an American mother. She was denied the ability, my mother was denied the ability to pass her American citizenship on. But Alice Paul's bill did not pertain to anyone born before the bill was passed. The bill was passed in 1934. My sister had been born in 1929. So we moved from Japan to Canada, and we tried to enter the United States in 1945 at the peak of the war with Japan. My sister was, I can't tell you how startling it was. We reached the border between Canada and the United States at Rouse's Point. My sister was 14 years old. I was about 10. She was denied entry to the United States. They put her in a room with cement walls and no windows at the age of 14 and would not allow anybody to visit her. They held her there at the border and said she was a Japanese enemy alien because she was born in Japan and her father was an American. He would be the only person. Women, my mother was not allowed to pass her American citizenship on to her daughter. And we were completely startled. They said, well, we have to hold her here and we have to send her to the Japanese internment camps out in Arizona, and your family will not be allowed to visit her. She's 14 years old, and they're going to take her and send her to the camps they kept Japanese in. Incidentally, that was unconstitutional in itself, but that came later. My mother took her shoes off and sat down and said, we're not moving out of this office until you release her. The people in charge couldn't do anything but follow their law. That's what they had to do with Japanese born people in the war at that time under those circumstances. So we waited and they phoned, and finally they got Washington and they said the President of the United States can sign an invitation for this 14-year-old girl to come into the country. But we have to keep checking You have to come back. You have to keep coming back and being verified. And we will not send her out to the camps internment of Japanese American citizens. Well, it was only the second one that the president had ever signed, but we did come across the border. And my mother tried to say, my other daughter is born of the same parents and also born in Japan. Why is she considered a naturally born resident, citizen of the United States? And her 5 years older sister is considered an enemy alien. They couldn't answer except to say that Alice Paul's bill had passed and it applied to those born 1934 or later. So we've had a very personal and unhappy introduction to Alice Paul. And that's why I went over to say thank you to her. And she reminded me of somebody who is so modest and so quiet and so thoughtful of all the work that others had put into it. So I just tell you, she is a person who has helped us all. She has defined what should be known as an American citizen. And there are many men who have benefited from this. She was not interested only in women, but she was energized by the mistreatment of women that she had seen worldwide. So I hope you can recognize that it's not illogical that people should be pressing for this to be part of the Constitution as well. Congress can play with legislation. And what happened to Renee, my sister, I think is worthy of somebody. Some legal person should write a paper about it, because she went from being an enemy alien, incarcerated and held, imprisoned, in fact. Then she was invited by presidential signature into the United States. She lived here long enough to be able to apply for citizenship and took the oaths and was made a citizen, naturalized citizen, not an original citizen, but a naturalized citizen. Then she was no longer an enemy alien or a naturalized citizen, because Congress decided that any right of a woman under the Alice Paul 1934 law would logically have had the right all the time, morally. And so they made their law retroactive and covering my sister's age. They actually changed their law backwards and made her a naturalized citizen. She carried every level of citizenship at one time or another. She took the oath, became a naturalized citizen. Then the law was made retroactive and they applied the 1934 law to her. So she was then a natural citizen, natural born citizen. and could have run for president of the United States. It's quite a range, and it shows you what Congress can do with a bill. They could not have done all of those changes if it had been part of the Constitution. That's a lot more difficult to change. So don't let anybody convince you that a congressional law is as permanent as something in the Constitution. And for that, we should all be very grateful to Alice Paul.
We're going to stop there now. Thank you so much, Josette. We would like to know if there are any questions, if you can record them. Deborah, do you remember, I remember more stories about the 90th birthday?
I do. I'm so glad you asked that. You know, it's funny because I wanted to just get back to Kara and Martha. I think they were asking about stories, and one comment I wanted to make, I was 16 years old at the time when I worked with her, and in retrospect, 16 years old is a baby. If I had come in contact with Alice Paul now or when I was 30, I think my experience would have been so much richer. I would have remembered some stories better. But what I did do is I went upstairs and I just got my recounting of her 90th birthday. And I don't know if everyone can see that, but this is from my scrapbook. This is an article that came from her 90th birthday. And I just wanted to point out Betty Deere did her hair and her dress that day. And one of the things I do remember is people wanted to bring her into the main area of Altona-Craig for her birthday celebration, and she really didn't have any interest in wanting to go into the main area. She wanted to stay in her room. She really didn't have any interest in celebrating her 90th birthday, period. But we did bring her into the big area, and there were some guests that came in. I don't remember who the guests were, but some guests came in to celebrate her birthday, and there was a news reporter that came in. And she was all dressed up, and there was a cake. And again, it wasn't about her. The birthday was about the cause, and if we could get some more states for the ERA and whatever. And I remember as she got pushed back out of the room into her little room, it was a big hallway that narrowed down into a narrower hallway before we took the turn into her room. And she was sitting in a wheelchair, and as any nurse or nurse's aide would do, her elbows were on the wheelchair, and they didn't want her to bang her elbows on the walls. And so someone said to her, "Miss Paul, could you bring your elbows in so that they don't get banged?" And she said, "My elbows will stay right where my elbows are." And I thought to myself, that is just the epitome of who she was. She was going to do what she wanted to do when she wanted to do it, and she wasn't going to take guff from anybody else, no matter what the intent was. And of course, we wanted to make sure she was safe and she didn't bang her elbows. But she was going to do what she wanted to do, and she wanted to keep her elbows on the chair. She didn't want to go in and have a celebration of her birthday. People made her do it, and so she was going to tell them, "I don't want to do that." She was a spitfire. You had to love her.
Yeah, I think the other stories I remember from when she was 90 is, look, if you want to give me a party, get young women here for the cause.
For the cause. The handout was
about the cause. I don't need a birthday party. Let's talk about Equal Rights Amendment. And then I think, didn't she get a call from the president's wife, was it Betty Ford or something, on her birthday? And they were surprised because she took the call. She didn't want to take the call or anything like that. But when she heard it was Betty Ford, she said, "Betty, thank you for calling. Get me your husband. We got to talk about the cause." Yep. It was, I mean, she was so totally focused. And I remember you told me, Debbie, which I thought was important, why she gravitated toward you and wanted you as her private duty nurse's aide. Do you remember why you think she chose you?
Was it because I was younger and I had younger friends and that we could do the physical part? I mean, I think in part she was the mind, she had the brains, and I had the body, the strength to do what she needed. Was it that?
Well, I thought, like, when we had talked, I mean, you're very outgoing, very chatty, very social, that you could get out there and spread the word for the cause, more than some of the other people. She saw potential in you, and they were always looking for potential ERA leaders that were young. And I think she saw that in you.
I do remember talking with her about the states, and she always wanted to keep track of how many states were left and how many more states needed to be gotten. I do remember that. The other thing I just wanted to show quickly is I do have, I don't know if people can see this, this is her signature. I did get that, her signature, and that's from August 31st, 1974. So I do have that. Anyway, I think there were some questions for Josette as well.
Actually, there definitely are just a few questions, but before we head into the questions, Leslie's going to put up a poll for this evening. There's a couple questions we'd like our participants to weigh in on, and this is for our program sponsor, the Connecticut Humanities. So Leslie, would you be able to launch the poll for us, and then we'll get into questions? So folks, if you can just quickly answer these 3 yes or no questions, that would be wonderful. And then we'll post the results and get right on to your questions. Has everyone had a chance to fill out the poll? Leslie, where are we with that?
We're just about there. I'll end it in a couple of seconds and then share it. But if you want to continue talking, you can certainly do that.
All right, great. Thank you, Leslie. So we'll post that in just a second. So Maureen had a question for Josette. Does every proposed amendment have a deadline or only on some amendments?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
The question is, does every proposed amendment have a deadline or only on some amendments?
No, each anything that they pass in Congress, they can add a caveat at the end of it saying anything that needs all the states to advise and consent, sort of, has to be done by, and they can set any date they want to. They just happened to set about a 5-year date on this, and they didn't meet it. Then they extended that, and I guess they still didn't meet it, although some of the states were putting this amendment into their state constitutions, but this was in regard to the national. So finally, Congress just eliminated the deadline altogether. That was just last year. And so it was only last year that they got the sufficient number of consent for the ERA. So it could immediately become part of the Constitution. It doesn't have to go back for anything. But now they're contending the Congress had no right to extend the deadline. So it's sort of in limbo now. And that's why I know you're going to hear about it.
Great. Thank you so much. I have a comment from Margaret who says, Ms. Williams, I think your story is as interesting as Alice Paul's. I'm so glad you were able to personalize for her what her work did. Thank you for sharing your story and contributing to Alice Paul's work.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
And another comment from Kara, that was wonderful, Josette. So again, thank you. And then Karen has a question. What was Alice Paul doing between 1934 and 1964 per the timeline?
I'm wondering, 1934.
1934.
That was when she was fighting in Congress. to apply this. That happened to me when I was born too. But they did pass the equal citizenship law. So you wanted to know what she was doing then after 1934?
In this time period here between 34 and 64.
Yeah, there was a handout that was given via email that had all the dates and what was happening at different timelines at points in her life. And that would probably help answer the question. She was doing a lot internationally. She was coming back and forth, living in Vermont, still working on the ERA. She would, as we say, you know, juggling many balls all over the world in different areas.
Thank you, Darla. So we just have a couple more minutes. If there's any last questions, please type them in the Q&A. And
I'd just like to say in conclusion that I think these are two very special women. I reached out through various social media and newspapers asking if there was anyone else in town who knew anything about her, had any personal relationships, to join us. So if you know anyone, you know, please let me know. Next week is going to be different. It is going to be a Zoom because the library is busy with another program. I've sent you some discussion questions. I'm not going to make a formal presentation. I will lead the discussion and add information. Hopefully you can see Iron Jawed Angels. Most people can stream it, get it on Netflix, you know, get it at Walmart's. It is worth seeing. So much of what I talked about is going to play out in that movie. So next week is very different. Our first 2 weeks were lectures. Today we had the personal view of Alice Paul, and we're going to end with a discussion. And the discussion includes questions from what we've talked about the first 3 weeks. It talks about various books and videos and movies and periodicals that you might have read that will better help you talk about this particular time period. And we're all going to link it to what's happening to today. I mean, what is happening today is so overwhelming. So we're going to talk about the past, but we're going to link it to today and the future.
Great, thank you, Darla. We just have a couple more comments. Kara wrote, is there a link to that handout that you can put in the Q&A? I don't know if we can do that, Leslie. Maybe you can respond to that question. It was sent out this past week. You can either contact me at ktefano@ridgefieldhistoricalsociety.org and I can send it to you after this call. And then
we're going to send it the questions, the discussion questions, and believe me, you can ask any question you want, but I just wanted to give some structure. It will be sent out again and you will have it in preparation for next week's session.
Great, thank you so much everybody for this wonderful, oh, please send the new link for handouts. Thank you. Okay, so we'll get that out to you for next week. And thank you to Deborah, Josette, and of course, Darla and Leslie in the library for this wonderful presentation. Have a good evening and we will see you next Wednesday.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.